welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. On this week's episode, I want to start with a little bit different focus than what we normally do. You know, a lot of times we start off and we look at naturalistic explanations for the things around us and how those explanations don't always give us a really good answer for the things that we observe. On this week's show, I want to flip that a little bit, and I want to look at this from the perspective of, if the universe was in fact created, then what would we observe? What would we expect to observe, and what do we observe as we look at the universe around us? You know, a few weeks ago when we started on this journey, we looked at the question of how the universe itself leapt into existence. And while I know some people are not going to agree with me, the most likely explanation based on the evidence that we have is that the universe itself leapt into existence by the hand of an independent third party. And that's not likely to change. There's not going to be new evidence that suddenly jumps on the table that can explain to us how everything came from nothing. Not as long as we stick to a correct definition of nothing being nothing and don't try to sneak things in there. So we saw the hand of intelligence as the universe leapt into existence. But as we take a little bit of a step back and we look at the universe that we got, do we recognize the fingerprint of intelligence in the universe that we have? And I think the answer is going to be clearly yes as we look at that. And let me back that up with some reasons why that might be. If an outside third party created the universe, they would have done so with a purpose. They would have done so with reason behind that. Now, when we look at the universe and we look at, let's say, what the Bible might say, for example, on why it was God created the universe, there's a couple of different things that immediately leap out to us. And let's see if the universe that we have is in fact a good candidate for that. Number one, the Bible details that the universe that was created around us was created so that God could have a relationship with us. So he created a very specific stage, you might say, to support life on this little blue planet floating around in space for us. We are that important. And more importantly, you are that important. God loves you so much that he created all of this to create an opportunity to have a relationship with me and with you and with every one of us. That's pretty remarkable when we look at it. So the first thing we would expect to see is that the universe is finely tuned to support life on this little blue planet of ours. And it is. When we talk about that and we look at that, but if you go all the way back to some of those early episodes where we were building a foundation, you remember one of the things that we talked about was that God couldn't just show up and blow us away with his presence. There had to be a component of faith to this. Because what God is looking for is a relationship. So he's got to come to us gently. He's got to come to us humbly, as Jesus came to us all those years ago. And so God can't just show up and blow us away with his presence. But what you might expect to see is that God has shown up in such a way and created the universe in such a way as to also reveal himself to us. So what we would expect to find is on this little blue planet is that conditions are uniquely well suited for the Creator to reveal himself to us as his creation. So as we have advanced in technology and understanding of the universe around us, what we might expect to see is that the more we learn about the universe around us, the more we see the fingerprint of a creator. Well, that's interesting because in the last 100 years, what have we seen? We've changed our attitude from thinking the universe was past eternal and there was no reason to look for an explanation of a creator, to suddenly now we recognize there was a finite beginning point of the universe in the recent past. And the universe came into existence in such a way as it does tend to point a finger to a beginning point, which seems to point a finger towards the question of what is the cause of that? Remember, we went through all that exercise. If something begins to exist, it has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So we start to see God revealing himself to us in such a way, and there's a fantastic book out there for you to read called The Privileged Planet. It's written by Doctors Gonzales and Richards. And in that book, they go through talking about how we seem to be situated in the perfect spot at the perfect time and on the perfect planet for the Creator to reveal himself to us. And that things are incredibly well situated on our planet so that we can observe the universe around us, so that we're in a safe, stable spot at the perfect time with a perfect sun, perfect solar system. I won't ruin it for you. We're going to talk a lot more about this down the road. But it does seem to be that God has built this universe, this extravagantly large universe, to perhaps reveal himself to us. And as we look at that, I kind of like to think of this as the Back to the Future component to all of this. One of the best movies of all times, by the way, as a kid who grew up in the 80s. But you know, there's a point at the first of the movie where Marty looks at Doc Brown and he goes, "You built a time machine out of a DeLorean?" And I love the quote from Doc Brown. He goes, "The way I see it, if you're going to build a time machine into a car, why not do it with some style?" I love that quote. It's a great movie. I love that line. I think that has some truth as it relates to God too. You know, as we look at this, what would we expect to see when we look at the universe around us? Well, we would expect to see purpose. We might expect to see the hand of the Creator revealing himself to us through the universe. But we would also expect to see beauty and creativity and all of these things. And when we look at the images that we're seeing from the universe around us, when we look at this little blue planet that we're on, my goodness, when we stop and take a step back and look around us, it's amazingly beautiful. It seems to show the hand of a Creator who put it all together for us and wanted us to have some place nice that we could look at that was just aesthetically pleasing. And that's probably a good segue to start getting into the fine-tuning question as we look at this. What we would expect to find is that actually a life-permitting universe is incredibly difficult and enormously rare. And amazingly enough, that's what we find. And that's going to be the big component of the fingerprint of God that we're looking at tonight. Sorry, fingerprint of a Creator that we're looking at tonight. When we look at this, I've used a couple of different examples of fine-tuning as we've talked about this. I also want to read to you real quick from the 136th Psalm. I was reading this the other day and this jumped out and grabbed me. Verse 4, "To him who alone does great wonders, for his mercy endures forever. To him who by wisdom made the heavens, for his mercy endures forever." That is such an interesting line in that psalm. That is something that was written 3,000 years ago. Isn't it interesting that the psalmist called out, "To him who by wisdom made the heavens"? It's really interesting because when you think about it, the universe doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be well constructed for our existence. In fact, there's an infinite number of ways almost, that it could be very different. I want to jump into this definition of fine-tuning and discuss that through this definition. This is from Stephen Meyer's book, Science and Evidence for Design in the Universe. Stephen Meyer and several other authors. It says, beginning in the 1960s, physicists unveiled a universe apparently fine-tuned for the possibility of human life. They discovered that the existence of life in the universe depends on a highly improbable but precise balance of physical factors. The constants of physics, the initial conditions of the universe, and many other of its features appear delicately balanced to allow for the possibility of life. Even very slight alterations in the value of many factors, such as the expansion rate of the universe, the strength of gravitational or electromagnetic attraction, or the value of Planck's constant, would render life impossible. Physicists now refer to these factors as anthropic coincidences because they make life possible for man, and to the fortunate convergence of all these coincidences as fine-tuning of the universe, given the improbability of the precise ensemble of values represented by these constants, and their specificity relative to the requirements of a life-sustaining universe. Many physicists have noted that the fine-tuning strongly suggests design by a preexistent intelligence. So what Dr. Meyer is talking about there is this concept that what we've uncovered in the last 60 years, what scientists have uncovered, is this enormously finely balanced group of items that come together to bring this, to make it possible for life in our universe. You know, that quote from Psalms really is actually very interesting when you think about it. So again, there's two options on the table as we look at this. We've talked about this in the preceding weeks. Either we hit the universal lottery on a level that is impossible to imagine, which we're going to talk about, or it was designed this way. And do we see the fingerprint of intelligence in all of this as we go forward? You know, it really does raise an interesting question when you start to think about it. When you look at Hoyle's discovery of carbon production, that's interesting. And it starts to make you wonder, which is what it did with Fred Hoyle. When you add to it what we talked about with Roger Penrose, who's one of the greatest scientists in the world today, and we look at Penrose's discovery, well, it goes from interesting to being compelling. And you start to look at that and you have to ask the question, with those two items put together, my goodness, when you start to think about that, it seems like less and less of a coincidence. But when you start to tack on a third and a fourth and a fifth, suddenly it goes from interesting to compelling to convincing. And that's what we're going to see as we move forward on this. As we look at this, we start to see the evidence for the fingerprint of design starting to pile up on this question of fine-tuning. You know, and that's really a microcosm of what we're looking at for this entire journey. We began by looking at the creation of the universe, that initial point where the universe jumped into existence. Well, that's interesting. That's compelling. When you add to it something like the fine-tuning of the universe, added on top of the creation of the universe, suddenly the fingerprint of intelligence starts to show through to a point where it goes from interesting to compelling to convincing. And at some point along this journey, we have to take a step back and look at that. You know, I think far too often people look at this and say, well, I've decided on naturalism because of the evidence. Okay, I think this is where we all start to take a step back and we look at the evidence that's in front of us. I think a lot of people have developed an idea of naturalism based on Charles Darwin's, the neo-Darwinian ideal of how life originated on this planet. And actually, I should say how life evolved on this planet, because there is no explanation from neo-Darwinian theory of how life could have began. But when we look at that and we walk through that, there's a real temptation for a lot of people to build a very firm belief in naturalism based on just one thing, a neo-Darwinian view of how life evolved on this planet. Well, that doesn't address nearly any of these things. And when you look at it, we've got to start putting those pieces together. It's in the journey, and we'll say that lots of times. It's in the journey where the strength of the evidence begins to show through. You know, perhaps no one piece of evidence on its own is enough, and I firmly believe that. No one piece of evidence is enough to convince them that theism is true, that there is an intelligent creator behind the universe, and by the way, he loves you. And at the same time, there's no one piece of evidence that probably convinced many people that naturalism is correct. It's in the strength of the journey where we find the truth. And that's what we're going to do as we look at this tonight. You know, whether we realize it or not, each one of us lives our lives based on the odds. You know, I think I've quoted several times that the odds of winning the lottery are 1 in 292 million. And that's not a great set of odds. You know, they draw the lottery 104 times a year. 52 weeks in a year, they draw it 2 times a week, 104 times a year. And you say, well, okay, 1 in 292 million, the odds are not that bad. You know, on average, somebody wins the lottery about 6 or 7 times a year. So the vast majority of those 104 times that they draw the lottery, nobody wins. It piles up and the drawings get bigger and bigger and the payout gets bigger and bigger in theory. But none of us are actually going to quit our job because we went and bought a lottery ticket today and we're convinced it's going to be a winner. And so we walk in and we quit our job because we might win the lottery. Now, there's a lot of people who walk in and quit their job because they did win the lottery, but nobody quits their job before the drawing on faith that they believe they're going to win the lottery because the odds are so bad. Whether we realize it or not, we all live our lives based on the odds in one form or another. I love, and you can probably see on the picture behind me, I love Yellowstone. Yellowstone is one of my favorite national parks. But Yellowstone is an active volcanic caldera. And so there is an element of risk to going to Yellowstone because you're walking around on a volcano that could erupt at any one given time. But I feel pretty safe doing it, despite some of the cheesy movies that they've made over the years of Yellowstone erupting. Because the odds are pretty slim that it's going to happen, and it's going to happen while I'm there. So I play the odds, whether I realize it or not, and I feel pretty safe in doing that. My wife and I had an opportunity to go swimming with the manatees down in Florida this last year. It was amazing. We had the best time doing that. I'd recommend it to anybody. Now, I suppose there's a chance you could be attacked by a shark while you're doing that. I mean, you are in salt water, and I guess it's theoretically possible. But let's be honest, the odds of that are remarkably small. So if you're offered the opportunity, you go swim with the manatees. It's just what you do. We've been to Paris before, and we've gone up in the Eiffel Tower. It's a touristy thing to do, but I'm a tourist. So we went up in the Eiffel Tower. Could the Eiffel Tower technically fall over? Well, yeah, I suppose it could. But the odds of that are so slim, I didn't hesitate to go up in the Eiffel Tower. I figure it's fairly safe to do. Now, it's a little bit scary because you're like crammed into the elevators like sardines, and you look up, and there's a picture that says, "Beware of pickpockets." And you realize that at that moment when your arms are squeezed together like this and you can't possibly move. So now the odds of that one worried me a little bit on the way up and down the elevator, but the odds of the Eiffel Tower falling over didn't bother me a bit. So in every one of those situations, I felt pretty comfortable doing it because in my mind, I had gone through the odds. We all live our lives that way. Whether we realize it or not, every day of our life, we look at things and we're willing to do them based on the odds. Or we're willing to walk away from them because we recognize the odds are too great the other way. I think it's also important to recognize that too often we don't look at the big picture around us and say, if there really is a creator, and he did create the universe, then I'm making a decision, what are the odds? And that's a little bit of what we're talking about here. And yes, I am talking about Pascal's wager ultimately. We'll talk about that a little bit more another evening on tonight's episode. But when we look at this, we are basing eternity on a set of analysis of what's around us. And I think way too often we don't think about it. We just kind of let this one roll off. It's like we go, well, I'm just not going to think about the odds of that one. And that's one of the things I want us to do tonight. We're looking at the math behind this. We're looking at the odds. And what are the odds that the things that we see around us point us to the fingerprint of a creator? So let's talk about this issue of fine-tuning a little bit. I think what we're going to see, there's several problems that the naturalist has to grapple with as we look at this problem. Number one is the scope. The scope of the problem as we talk about how big of odds that we're talking about here. You remember, this was what it was that captured Fred Hoyle's attention as he looked at the probabilities of whether or not carbon could be created and how carbon was being created and how enormously unlikely it was for all of these things that had to be working together in just the perfect proportions to get him there. The same way, the discovery that Roger Penrose has made, as we look at the original phase, space, volume, one of these fine-tuned conditions, remember, the odds of that were 10 billion to the 123rd power, a number that is just incomprehensibly large when we think about it. Remember, the number of atoms in the universe is 10 to the 80th power. 10 billion to the 123rd power dwarfs that like it's just impossible to imagine the numbers so big. Stephen Hawking puts another one of these components into place for us when he talks about the initial expansion rate of the universe just after the Big Bang. To quote from Dr. Hawking, "Why did the universe start out with so nearly the critical rate of expansion that separates models that recollapse from those that go on expanding forever, that even now 10,000 million years later, it is still expanding at nearly the critical rate? If the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have collapsed before it ever reached its present size." I'm a numbers guy. That is a massively, massively big number. I think we talked about on a previous episode, trying to illustrate what that would look like. If you covered the entire United States in marbles, half an inch deep, and you put one red marble in a sea of blue marbles covering the entire United States, and you blindfolded the person and you said, go out and pick one marble, but choose wisely, the fate of the universe rests in your hands. You have one chance to get this right, pulling from that many marbles. It gives you a feel for how impossible of a task this could possibly be. And that number is infinitesimal in comparison to Penrose's number that we were talking about a few episodes ago. It's just impossible to imagine the scope of how big these numbers are. So that's the first problem that we're dealing with when we talk about these things. These are not small numbers. The second problem that we're going to have is you can't consider these independently of each other. It's the problem that we talked about with Richard Dawkins a few weeks ago when we looked at the anthropic principle. None of these are one-off events. Every one of these fine-tuned items interacts with the others. Their numbers are so big and so impossible to imagine, but they don't exist independently of each other. They stack on top of each other. So when you look at what Hawking is talking about, and then you look at what Fred Hoyle discovered, and then you look at what Penrose discovered, you multiply them one on top of another on top of another. So Penrose's number is just impossible on its own. And you can look at Penrose's number and say, well, it's impossibly unlikely, but you know, one-off events do happen. Well, that's true. They do happen. But they don't happen again and again and again. If we go back to our old lottery example, the odds of winning the lottery, 1 in 292 million. And like I said, 6 or 7 times a year out of the 104 drawings, somebody wins the lottery. But nobody wins the lottery on the first drawing of the week and then turns around and wins it on the second drawing of the week, and then the first drawing of the next week, and so on and so on and so on for dozens of times in a row. What would you think if that happened? You would think it's been rigged. You would think somebody's cheating. Clearly, there's the hand of intelligence. Intelligence has intervened and it's overturned blind luck. Intelligence has overridden chance. And that's what we're dealing with here. We're talking about things that are so impossibly large. And again, they're not only big on their own, they also interact with each other. So if you change one, you cause enormous problems with others. But one on top of another, these things build. Let's go through a little bit of a list as we talk about this. Again, we talked, and I'm going to kind of walk through 10 items and just talk about these. And each one of these is massively, the numbers are just extraordinary. And I'll give some odds as we go through them. We talked about Hoyle and the production of carbon. We've talked about Roger Penrose, the original phase space volume. We've talked about Hawking and the expansion rate of the universe. The mass of quarks, 10 to the 21st power. Gravity, 10 to the 35th power. The effective cosmological constant. You remember Albert Einstein, when Einstein started to get wind of the fact that there were problems, the universe was expanding, and that meant there was a finite starting point. Einstein came up with the cosmological constant, and Einstein set it at a specific point so that the universe could be past eternal. Well, that was cheating and it wasn't right. But Einstein was correct about the cosmological constant. 10 to the 90th power. Universal density. The mass of neutrinos. The electromagnetic force. The strong nuclear force. And the list goes on and on and on. Strong nuclear force. 1 part in 200 to the 38th power. I mean, these numbers are enormously large, and any one of them on its own is enough to blow luck out of the equation. You can play the luck card just one time, but any one of them on their own beyond that, when you start piling the second and the third and the fourth, and there are dozens of these finely tuned factors that scientists have discovered over time. When you look at all of them and you bring them together, the numbers are so impossibly large that luck is just not a possible option. And we are going to talk about the multiverse on the next episode to bring all of this together and to squash this idea of luck once and for all. But all of this points to the fingerprint, the clear fingerprint of design when we look at the universe around us. That's what makes this so incredibly powerful. I love this quote. It says, if we modify the value of one of the fundamental constants, something invariably goes wrong, leading to a universe that is inhospitable to life as we know it. When we adjust a second constant in an attempt to fix the problems, the result is generally to create 3 new problems for every one that we solve. The conditions in our universe really do seem to be uniquely suitable for life forms like ourselves, and perhaps even for any life form of organic chemistry. That quote just sums it up so very well of what we're looking at in all of this. What we have to look at and what we have to recognize is that the odds are simply too great to write this off to just luck. The universe shows all of the fingerprints of design. I go back to that quote from Psalms 136. To him who by wisdom made the heavens. The universe doesn't have to be this way. There's no reason that the universe is as we find it. And all we have to do is to get to this point of looking at it and saying, what is the most likely explanation for the numbers that we find? And the reason that we're looking to do that is because we're trying to answer the most important question in the entire universe. Is there a creator? If there is, we need to know that. And we shouldn't keep pushing this off, looking for more and more and more evidence and keep moving the goal line further and further down. I mentioned 3 things before that you shouldn't hesitate to do if you have the opportunity. Visit Yellowstone, swim with the manatees, because why would you worry about being attacked by sharks, or going up in the Eiffel Tower. 3 amazing things and something you shouldn't hesitate to do. But if I looked at you and said, well, the part that really scares me is what if the Yellowstone caldera erupted? And as it erupted, it created a worldwide earthquake that was so big that it caused the Eiffel Tower to fall over while I'm standing on the Eiffel Tower. And as I'm on the Eiffel Tower, it falls over and I get dumped into the River Seine. And just when I think I'm safe, as I land in the river, there's suddenly a shark swimming up the river and I'm attacked by a shark. You would rightfully look at me and say, that is ridiculous. You would never live your odds based on something that outlandish. All 3 of those things on their own, when you take them individually, the odds of them are just so incredibly rare, you would say, hey, you do it anyway because the odds are so slim, why would you bother? But when you stack them, one on top of another on top of another, the odds go from being kind of silly to utterly ridiculous. Nobody would live their life that way. But those 3 things stacked together, Yellowstone erupting, the Eiffel Tower, the shark thing, when you look at those 3 things even stacked together, as ridiculous as that sounds, it's nothing in comparison to what Penrose has discovered, or what Fred Hoyle discovered, or Stephen Hawking was talking about, or any of these other scientists. By the way, none of those 3 scientists, Christians. None of those 3 scientists coming at this from a theistic point of view. All 3 of those scientists strongly skeptical, if not atheist or agnostic. So at some point in time, the odds absolutely matter. And as we take each step along this journey, we began with where did the universe come from? Now we're looking at the fine-tuning of the universe. If at every step along the way, the most likely explanation is the hand of an independent third party. As we start to identify that fingerprint of design, and I think in this case we can clearly see it, then sooner or later I think you have enough evidence to make a good decision in this process. And that's what we're looking to do in all of this. And I hope you'll always remember the most important thing that we start off every podcast with, which is God loves you. So at the end of this journey, were we to find ourselves staring at the fingerprint of intelligence and the hand of a creator, it's important to remember that that creator loves you and did all of this for you. Next week, we're going to tackle the question of the multiverse. Does the multiverse get us out of all of this? We're actually going to hear from Richard Dawkins actually recognizing that these points actually raise some good issues, but he's going to look at the multiverse as the way out. And does the multiverse give us a way out as we look at these odds? And that's what we're going to address next time. I want to thank you so much for joining us this week on Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. You can find us out on iTunes and Spotify. And if you like this podcast, I hope you'll consider hitting that like and subscribe button. You can also find us on our website at prooftograce.com, or you can email us at prooftograce@yahoo.com if you've got any questions. I want to thank you so much for joining us once again, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.